I'm Sarah Jackson, and this is Internal Comms Pro, the podcast. We're getting the gears turning as we talk to the experts on our ever-changing world of internal communications. This season, we're shifting the mindset.
One of the first things we did was we would talk with our staff members about why they loved working at Teach for America, what made them want to stick around, what were the things they valued most, and almost always flexibility would come up. They would say, like, I can work wherever I need to, whenever I need to, and I don't have to conform to an exact 8 to 5, go to an office to be able to get my work done. They trust me to be able to do it in a variety of ways.
"2021 hasn't been the year many of us expected. We hoped that after the panic of COVID settled down, that things would eventually go back to normal. Now that the year is almost over, it's clear that the new normal is in development. Many companies are moving to a hybrid solution, but that might be easier said than done. Luckily, today our guest for this episode has learned from experience. Today we're talking with Clifton Johnson, Senior Managing Director of Staff Culture and Communication Strategy at Teach for America. Believe it or not, Teach for America already had a hybrid working environment prior to COVID, and through Clif's previous experience, he has several tips on running a hybrid work environment that is comfortable for your fellow employees. Let's dive in.
My name's Clif. I work at Teach for America, and I am the Senior Managing Director of Staff Culture and Communications.
Clif, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. I know we both crossed each other's path at the Advanced Learning Institute's conference. And right when you finished, I told our producer, I said, oh my gosh, we got to have Clif on. Everything that he just said, I wish I would have just pushed record. It would have been a great episode. So welcome to the show. Start us off here and give us your backstory. How did you get involved in this amazing world of internal communications?
I actually studied communications. That was the thing that I thought I was going to do. If you would have asked me when I graduated from college at 22, what do you want to do? What do you think your career is going to be about? I would have said nonprofit communications. That would have been my answer. And yet I still took a really winding road to get there. When I first wrapped up undergraduate studies, I got into social work, and I was doing direct practice social work here in Chicago. I worked with recovering addicts. I worked with youth that were in at-risk communities. And I ended up becoming a Peace Corps volunteer along with my wife shortly after that. And then when I got back from Peace Corps, I got involved in recruitment, which again was partly a communications thing, because I thought it would be great to spend all day telling stories about my Peace Corps experience and my previous work. So I did recruitment at both Peace Corps and Teach for America. But I kept getting pulled into all kinds of communication roles, not just with candidates, but with partners, internally thinking about how our region understood ourselves and our work and how we told that story. It was always something that I was getting pulled into. And then in the last couple of years, got to start focusing fully on internal communications at TFA. So it took me a while to get back to it, but that really was where I thought my niche would be at the very beginning.
So before we get started, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of background about Teach for America? How's it structured? Kind of set this up here for us.
Yeah, you bet. So when most people think about Teach for America, they understandably think teachers, which makes sense, right? It's right in our title. And essentially, if we were to describe the problem or the challenge that we exist to address, there are kids growing up in disenfranchised communities across the country that lack access to resources and opportunities, and they are attending schools that are not equipped to meet their needs. And so we are an organization that exists to do leadership development work to address that issue. So we are an organization that's a diverse network of leaders who are confronting educational inequity. But we've been around for about 30 years now. And our first decade was about really proving that model in the first place. The second decade kind of was about scaling up. And then the last decade has been about really changing the narrative of what's possible. And we're at a point now where we've got 60,000 people who have done our program. And we place about 5,000 people a year. I actually just focus on the staff members that are supporting that work. So that is about 1,500 or so people that are doing that work across the country.
Absolutely. So it sounds like Teach for America has always had this hybrid working remote environment, right? So what did you have to do to adapt when COVID hit? Did you have to do anything, or was it like business as usual?
Right. It's funny because I stepped into this work of, in particular, thinking staff culture work. And one of the first things we did was we would talk with our staff members about why they loved working at Teach for America, what made them want to stick around, what were the things they valued most. And almost always flexibility would come up. They would say, like, I can work wherever I need to, whenever I need to, and I don't have to like conform to an exact 8 to 5, go to an office to be able to get my work done. They trust me to be able to do it in a variety of ways. And so in some ways it would think that we were pretty well set up because everybody already had their laptop. You're on mute was not a new phrase for us in March 2020, right? We were using Zoom all the time. So in many ways we were set up for it. And yet there were still really major disruptions. They were just a different type of disruption than an organization that was very office-based and very desk-based was going to be. First off, we relied a lot on travel because we were so spread out. And so as a result of that, locally, you got people who have to be out and about in schools. They're used to hosting events with alumni. They are like traveling around all the time. And then nationally, if you're someone like myself, my manager is in San Antonio, I'm in Chicago, another one of my teammates is in Ohio, another one's in DC, right? Like the only way for us to actually see each other was travel. And I also think, as I talked about earlier, because we're divided across teams, one of the other things I heard from staff when I started doing this work was I feel really connected to my team, but I feel kind of disconnected to the broader organization. Like the people I work with every day on my team, I'm super tight with, but what's happening with all the other people who do jobs like me in other places? And I think that's a fairly common experience, but now all of a sudden those teams couldn't be together in the way they were used to.
Well, and I think it's a good point to note that I think sometimes we as the internal communicator, we get tired of putting together the Monday Minute, right? It's like, but then once you don't do it, then people were probably like, "Where's the Monday Minute?" And then, or if you don't hear, but I think to kind of push through that, or how do you re-jazz it up, or how do you keep your will to continue to do the Monday Minute because everybody loves it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I think it's really important that you actually have the data and measurement tools to know whether something's working or not. Because I think it is so easy, to your point, to get bored of it and be like, well, is anybody even reading this thing? And I think being able to answer that question is important. And not just quantitatively. I mean, there are limitations to how much you can quantitatively understand how many people are opening an email or clicking on things. It's important to be in dialogue with people, even if that person maybe they don't open it up and click on every single thing, but it matters to them that it's there. And it matters to them that I'm not inundating them with other emails or asking them to go to different places. And it feels like a scavenger hunt. This thing comes right to them and it rolls everything up. And so those data points really help. And it helps me also when senior leaders are like, but I don't want to do that. I want to do this fun thing. I want to do this other way of doing things. And it's like, great, you can do that, but you're going to have to train everybody to know where to find that and get into it. And this other thing that we have, it might be kind of boring to you, but everybody already knows exactly where to find it and how it works. So if you learn how to leverage that well, you've already got a whole group of people that will click on it if, and this is the big if, they're interested in it and it's relevant to their work. Sometimes if they don't click on it, it's not because it was in the wrong place. It's because it just wasn't relevant to their day-to-day work. And we have to ask ourselves the question of how we're telling the story and what content we're putting out there.
Yeah. Well, and I love the tip on the quick pulse check because you're right, that's quick, it's easy, but then you've got good sound bites that might come out of it so that you can say, "Hey, no, so and so actually said this. It's not a big old long, huge in-depth employee survey. Not that those, aren't important, but I love that with how busy I feel like a lot of our listeners are to not forget, hey, just walk down the hall or quick Slack message or call somebody and quickly get their feedback. That's a great tip, not only on just your communication but maybe other things that you might be doing that you just want to get a quick pulse check on. I love
Yeah,
that.
that's what I missed most from offices, to be honest. I'm based here in Chicago. I don't actually have to be at the office. As I said earlier, like my manager's not there. My team's not there. I don't have to go. I could have been working from my basement for the last 10 years that I worked to Teach for America if I wanted. But I went to the office anyway. And part of the reason I went was for those little interactions you just described, that I could stop by someone's cube and ask them what they thought about something, that I could run into somebody in the hallway unexpectedly and get suddenly this really valuable data insight. And for me, part of what was really hard personally to adapt to pandemic life as I started working from home much more often and not having an office anymore was I didn't have any way to get that unless I intentionally reached out to people. And you can email people. We use Slack at our organization. You can Slack people. Um, but that's not the same as being able to stop by. And so I think there is something different to being able to find a way where you can actually truly connect with people and hear what they're learning.
So I guess the learning is if you are the listener and you're kind of comfy and being in your PJs all day, it might be, are you saying it might be wise to maybe relook at your schedule and say, all right, I need to make the effort to find time to go into the office, but not just to go, but to go when people are there, because and to have an intention of I need to have some water cooler talk every week if it's in person. So what were the three questions? What am I doing that's working?
Hmm. Yeah, I think of it as stop, start, continue. So, what do we need to do right now? What do we need to stop doing that is a waste of our time? That is just not actually getting us to the outcomes we're driving towards. What do we need to start doing that is going to get us to a new place? And what do we need to continue doing? So, in the example of the Monday Minute, that was a very clear continue for us. We knew that we needed to keep doing that. This is valuable. We also had to start some things because especially in the early days of COVID, there was so much stuff coming at people. Honestly, there still is, right? Like week to week, everything's changing for all of us. We are figuring out all kinds of guidelines. We're figuring out where we can go and where we can't go. At our organization right now, we're talking about what schools can we visit or not visit? Are we wearing masks? How are these things working? There's some stuff that was coming on such a fast cadence at points that we couldn't just wait for the next Monday Minute. So we had to start some things to be able to connect in between those cycles. Like this cycle is not always working for us because things are just moving too quick. And then there were also things that we had to stop because it just didn't really fit where we were at that moment in time. And an example of that for us, it's great to pull 1,500 people together for giant live spaces, but man, when all of them are working from home and they expect every single live event to be super interactive and live into the adult learning principles that an education organization believes into and be super two-way and dynamic, wow, that's hard to do with 1,500 people. And so there were points where we had to go, maybe this space isn't the best space for us to try to do this thing we're trying to do. And so there were very clear things that fell into that continue bucket, that fell into that start bucket, and fell into that stop bucket. And no matter which order you talk about them, there's something in every column.
And given the nature of this new hybrid, remote in office, it's fluid. So did you feel like you had to do that cycle of asking yourself, what are we stopping, what do we start and continue much more frequently?
Yep, absolutely. The happy hour example is the classic one, right? I mean, think about how we were so excited about that, right? There was a stretch there where I was like, I had like three of them for work and three of them for friends. And I was just like, you all, as a person who's been working at a hybrid organization for the last 10 years, I have been doing Zooms all day, every day for a long time. And you all are asking a lot of me to show up and do a happy hour right now. It just, that was not life-giving for me, but people were so excited about it and it faded. Right. And I think similarly, we all had these great ideas of like, man, every week we're going to do an address from our senior leader. It's going to be great, right? But you also have to think about how many times you're asking people to go click and watch that thing. There better be something new or relevant because that's a lot to ask for your user. And for that senior leader, that's a drain too. That's an extra thing. And so I think it used to be that we could step back and ask start, stop, continue once a quarter or once a year. I'm not sure that cycle's enough anymore. I think we have to be willing to do it more frequently and ask ourselves. And sometimes we have to give ourselves permission for it to be a pretty quick check. It doesn't always have to be a day-long retreat to ask that question. You can just pause really quickly with a colleague and go, wait a second, is this thing still working the way we want it to? And it can be a fast conversation, but it's still important to get that cycle more frequently for sure. There's one other thing that I would mention, Sarah, which is so we as an organization had to recognize the amount of expertise that we had inside of ourselves. And what I mean by that is, for that team that's based locally here in Chicago, they had to really rapidly adjust to hybrid life, to remote life. They had never done it before. And I was sitting here in this city, having been on a remote team for a decade before that. Think about how much stuff my team had probably tried to stay connected or to be able to know what was happening or to develop a cadence of communications just for our team. Those were all things that we had within our organization. And so we had to really think about how do we help the teams who have been doing this for a long time learn or teach and share what they've been learning with the teams who are just getting used to this. And similarly, how do we help the teams who are just getting used to this and are trying things share stuff with those other teams so that all of the things they've been trying aren't stale and old hat, that they're actually like, oh, I hadn't even thought about that. I'm really glad that Chicago tried that when this transition happened. And that interorganizational learning sounds like a thing that should just be naturally happening, but it doesn't. You have to foster spaces for that. You have to create opportunities for it. It doesn't just automatically happen. It takes a lot of structure to help learning happen. And for us, we had a lot of opportunities there early to do real time learning. And I think what we've been thinking about lately is we actually need to invest even more heavily in that. We need more spaces that are smaller conversational spaces that really allow for connections across the org so that people can share what they're learning and trying in real time.
So let's dive into that. I love that you make it a point because again, I think internal communicators are so good at this, but I don't think the company values the thought of how do you facilitate and choreograph, like you said, the small conversations, the learning that can happen. Talk to me about, do you have an organizational structure? Like, okay, if you're going to facilitate learning or connection, this is our formula. This is the way we think about it. Like, how are you teaching the teams that might not be used to it to develop the connections and to, like, can you give us some examples of what did you teach them and how did you teach them?
Yeah. So part of it for us was about being willing to experiment, honestly, and to then be on a rapid kind of iteration cycle of we tried a thing, how did it work? How do we want to adjust it? Should we try it someplace else? Should we stop? Like being willing to really regularly do that. I talked about accelerating the cycle of start, stop, continue, and I think there's an experimentation cycle too. Um, for us, I have, it's me and one other person that are spending all of our time on staff communications. I mean, we're a big org, but there's only a couple of us that are thinking about that big picture connection across the org. And as a result of that, when somebody's like, well, I want a chance to learn from other people who are doing my exact job, I cannot be fully dedicated to learning and development for every type of job across a 1,500 person organization. That's all my time right there. And even then, it probably wouldn't be enough. And so I think we had to really encourage people to say, well, like, if you see a space that you think needs to happen, great. What do you need to be able to create that space? Like, what are the conditions that we need to create so that you can go do that thing? And what are some of the principles that need to be true across it? And then once we're trying a few of those different spaces, what's working and what's not working?
Our talk with Cliff will continue after a message from our friends at Circle. We all know there's a large shift happening where employees are trading their cubicles for kitchen tables. There's a big question that we're all trying to solve. How can we keep our remote workforce truly engaged and informed? Well, our sponsor Circle has developed the Broadcast Suite to help internal communicators send the right message at the right time. Through intelligent cross-channel, Broadcast curates a connected experience for each employee across all their most valuable channels: email, SharePoint, Teams. There's even an option to launch an employee mobile app. Head on over to circle.com/ICP. That's CERKL.com/ICP to learn how the Broadcast Suite engages deskless workers worldwide. Welcome back. In this next part, Cliff shares several tools he and his team use to keep clear communication with their employees. We'll also discuss the importance of the learning cycle and how, with any learning, you can't skip steps just because they seem hard. Now let's jump back in. Anything else? Any other ideas of how you've kept that connection? And because I know people, I feel like, are fatigued by this. And the big struggle now, right, is okay, How do you foster connection in this? Because for a lot of our folks, it is new, right? How do you sustain that?
So I mentioned earlier that we're Slack users, right? That we started using Slack as a platform for ourselves org wide a couple years ago, and Slack has been great. It's suddenly allowed those people who are feeling slightly disconnected from the broader organization to be able to have a way to go find somebody to like raise their hand in a channel and be like, hey, anybody else doing this kind of thing? Or to ask a question like, does anybody know the answer to this? Because I can't find it anyplace. Those are good things that allow us to stay connected. But we also saw when suddenly all of us were in pandemic life, people were on Slack just all the time, right? We're on Slack, first of all, across time zones. So you've already got that dynamic, right? I got somebody in Hawaii that right now is not awake yet. And I'm already halfway through my workday. So we've got that dynamic of Slack. And then you've also got this sense of like, when all of us started working more flexibly, it sounds great, except for when you just start working all the time, because there isn't a barrier anymore between work and personal. If you don't have that commute to kind of like stop yourself from diving in. And we definitely saw that happening. And we also started seeing people leaning on Slack maybe a little bit too much to do things it wasn't designed for. And so part of what we started thinking was like, okay, what are the agreements or guiding principles that are going to be in place to allow us to all be on the same page on what we want this platform to be? And we realized we had rolled this thing out and started using it without answering some pretty basic questions. Like, how often am I expected to check this thing? Like, which is like, when can I go away from it? How are we going to think about work hours for people? Do we write people at night or do we not? Like, there are things that are pretty basic. And I think sometimes in our rush to find new ways to connect, we don't ask those questions and we just start rolling things out. And so that was a case where we had to press pause. And we actually looked at the analytics and we're like, who are our top Slack users that are using this thing the most? Let's pull them together and let's form a committee and let's just hear from them. What's working, what's not working on your teams? What do you think we need in terms of clarity of expectations? And one of the first things we realized was we needed people to be more comfortable stepping away from this thing. Like having it nonstop, constantly in the background was not actually helping us. It was hurting us in some cases. And in some cases, it was a distraction. There are some people who really love it and want to use it, and that's great, but let's at least set a baseline so we're all on the same page. And so I think it's never too late to ask yourself whether you've got the expectations and agreements in place and clear enough up front that people have clarity and they can make the good choices. It's never too late for that. Even if you're a ways into it, it's never too late to be like, wait a second. Do we have clarity on this? Are we all on the same page on what's expected of us? And if not, how do we get to a point where we are? And I think that was a case where we had to go back to the ground one.
Well, and I love the position that it puts the internal communicator in, which again, this season is all about mind shift. And I want the listener to recognize and know they are the leader, right? People are looking to us to facilitate that process. And when you do, I think it positions that internal communicator in a really in a leadership way to kind of lead these people. And I would even imagine if I'm getting onboarded, there's a neat story in there that probably aligns with your values, probably going back to those principles and that big picture that make them like that one piece of what you just said that makes people kind of feel that culture. And even amongst, this hybrid situation, I love that.
I love what you just said about values, Sarah, because we thought, I think, at the outset of the process, well, we have core values. We don't need to get into all of these like detailed, specific agreements or whatever. But you still do. Like, it's great that you're grounded on the values, but I don't know that my core values are going to help me decide whether or not I should send a message at 6 o'clock Eastern or not. Like, that's a very specific application of a value. And I think there is a point there where you go, we might need a little bit more clarity than just be, telling people, hey, on a day-to-day basis, we act with humility. It's like, great. But what does that mean right now for my Slack message? Like, could you help me get a little more specific about that? And sometimes we might have different interpretations of what the values mean in that case. And that's actually an okay thing for us to dig into that. But I think what we've come to believe is like the clarity is really important. And there are still tons of areas where we don't have enough clarity yet. And those are the things we're going back to try to be able to add more of it. It's a constant process. You never check off living into your values or living into your commitments to equity. And you also never check off, we are now fully functional as a communications team and we don't have any work to do. It's ongoing work. And so you've just got to be comfortable with that constant cycle of revisiting and asking the hard questions.
I love that. And clarity, you are so, and that's why I think there are so many things that are not clear because of the ever changing nature of the time and the history that we're in. But again, instead of, I want our listener to mind shift this, right? Instead of being all hot and bothered about it's so confusing and I don't know, and everybody's here, you are the leader, right? Develop, you are the one. This is like for such a time as this is your time, like to stand up and be the leader to facilitate so that at the end it results in more clarity, and then you can communicate that out and now you've won because you were the leader of there's such a power I think in this process, I guess is what I'm hearing you say with all these things.
But that facilitation word you just used, that's very different than you need to come up with the answers. No, you need to facilitate the process, which probably means modeling some vulnerability along the way. Because I guarantee you there are things that you've tried that have not worked. There are certainly things I've tried that haven't worked, right? There are strategies we tried for internal comms that we were like, this is going to be the thing. And it went up in flames. And at that moment, if I actually say, hey, this is a thing we tried and I don't think it worked, here's what we're hearing from people. Here's what we're going to try differently as a result of it. Then people actually are like, okay, it seems like we're actually learning together. Like I'm actually interested in pulling up a seat at the table to have a conversation about what our agreements are going to be next time because we were willing to acknowledge that maybe it wasn't working the way we wanted to, and we need to try something different. And so that vulnerability piece is really important.
And I love that this is obviously, this is the Teach for America, episode, but which would make sense that I think it just makes me as an internal communicator with all this new technology and all these new guidelines and everything is new that we're trying to do. And for again, a lot of our listeners, it's new for them to be the leader. It's new for them to have to, figure out new office structure. All this is like new, but if you can mind shift it to you are learning and you are creating a learning environment, you know that in and of itself, because we're trying to sell the organization on our value, and then there's a trust there, and that because you're sharing everything that you're learning all along the way. Do I you think I have that right from an organization that that's all about learning?
Here's the other thing about learning that I think we've learned the hard way in some ways as a society and as organizations in the last 18 months or so. You don't get to skip that hard, vulnerable moment of trying something and having it not work. You don't get to skip the hard stuff in a learning cycle. That's the moment where you are feeling at a loss and disconnected and not sure how to keep people on the same page is actually a really critical part of it. Those catalytic moments that we have are part of how we figure out where are we going to go together from here. And they're an opportunity, but they also don't feel like an opportunity sometimes. I had a colleague on my team for years who used to call them chopportunities, for challenge and opportunity at the same time. And that we have a lot of those. We have a lot of chopportunities that we are trying to figure out as organizations in this moment in time. And I think it's really important for us to remember they're both of them. That this is an opportunity for us to learn and learn together.
You don't get to skip the hard part, because I think when we think, oh gosh, I don't want to feel that, then that also breeds procrastination, right? Because I don't want to feel that, right? But if you already know it is you're going to feel it and you got to go through it and it's going to be hard. But again, to shift your brain, you want to feel that because that feeling is evoking the feeling of learning. I think, and that has always been my issue. I get it. We're supposed to be learning, but the emotion that sometimes comes with learning, it doesn't feel good. What we're dealing with is, yes, people are scared, and that's totally understandable. But then you've got a different kind of group of people. They're not. They're done. They're over it. We're going back in the office. So how do you deal with this dynamic of like the us versus them, the have and the have nots?
So first things first, I think one thing that we have really tried to focus on throughout this cycle is what does it look like for our staff members to feel supported and valued and safe. Like that's the first thing, right? And so in the early days of the pandemic, that was like an emergency PTO bank people could draw from, and it was additional support if you were working from home, and like do you need to move to part-time for just a while? That's okay, right? Like we had to roll out a lot of supports to people to make sure that they actually could navigate this moment. But all of those supports, back to that learning cycle thing, didn't stick around for the entire 18 months, right? We tried some things and we evolved some others. So now we're at this moment where some people are at one point and some people are at another. And we have a former board member at Teach for America, who's also the president at Spelman. Her name is Dr. Beverly Tatum. She wrote a very well-known book on diversity and racial equity called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria?" That we've often referenced as we talk about race at an organization that really needs to dig into it pretty regularly. And she talks about, in an analogy, she talks about school photos or big group photos, and how if you took a group photo and maybe a few people didn't show up and they weren't in the photo, the first time around they'd be like, "Oh, I guess I missed the photo." But once that happened a second or a third or a fourth time, that group of people is going to start to feel like, "Oh, maybe I'm just not a part of this group. Like maybe I'm just, this feels kind of intentional and on purpose, right? Like I'm missing for a reason." And I think for us in the internal comms world, I do regularly ask myself the question, can everyone see themselves in this class picture right now? Like, is everyone feeling like they're showing up? And on an office by office or team by team basis, back to that point of like a ton of autonomy and experimentation, there are going to be a lot of teams that try a lot of different things. I need to make sure in our internal communications that goes out to the org that we are sharing a variety of voices, a variety of experiences, and really thinking, how do we elevate all of those different perspectives in our work and not just have it come from one lens. And that requires a lot of questions of a lot of people who are putting content together.
I love that. So I want to go back to several big key things I think that you said for our listener. So the first thing is, when you're trying to tackle this, you said something that I think was so good, that you went back to the guiding question. So it's almost like start with the end in mind. And then you said, we asked ourselves, all right, what's going to make everybody feel, you said, supported, value, and safe. Now, for other organizations, it might be three other words that mean something there. So I think to start there as a centering thing, can everyone see themselves in this picture? That is an amazing question. And then when you do choreograph those moments, then did you capture a variety of experiences depending on where everybody's sitting, so you get everybody's voice? And then I think to then think about, okay, so when people are going back into the office, then are you even being even more diligent about what is happening now in that office? Because the other issue we're dealing with is people want to go into the office, but those people are going because other people are going. So you have to then put structure around that. Like, all right, well, if we are going in 3 days a week, then we're going to have food there that day. So people that are going in will want to come and get back into, you got to give them a reason to be there. Is that what you're feeling too?
I think we're also feeling a sense of, we talked about clarity earlier. Clarity's big here too. Like, are we requiring people to go back to the office? Or are they getting a choice about whether they want to go back to the office? If they're getting a choice about whether to go back to the office, how does that change the way that I think about the spaces that are happening in the office, right? Like, there's a lot of clarity pieces there. One of the things we heard from people when we were first like thinking about offices reopening and people coming back, one of the things that staff said was like, well, no offense, but I'm a junior staff member and I have a strong feeling that the senior staff members are going to feel comfortable showing up or not showing up whenever they feel comfortable with it. And I'm going to be expected to be there all the time. And that feels like this is going to be really hard for us to navigate. And so we had to ask ourselves a lot of questions about power and how are those power and influence differentials showing up in the ways that we decide these things? And then how does that change the way that we think about offering that clarity, right? And so I do think it's another moment for agreements and expectations and clarity. It, just like anything else, is actually making sure that you've heard from all the people who are going to be impacted by the way you approach something, and then you take the most thoughtful approach that you can and share honestly how you got to that approach and why. That's critical, because those folks otherwise are going to look at you and be like, Yeah, you're opening the office up again and you're throwing food out on the table, but I don't want to show up there and I don't feel comfortable grabbing food in a communal space right now. Sorry. That's just I do not. That's not where I'm at, right? And if you haven't surfaced that person's opinion along the way as you tried to figure out what you were going to do and how you were going to communicate it, it's probably not going to land the way that you thought it would. And it's not going to land because the process wasn't there to actually hear from people.
I came in rushing into the interview as I normally am because, everybody's so busy doing a thousand things. And then now I feel like I can exhale, and I'm sure our listeners feel that way. Like, this has been amazing. Like, I can do this. I know that there's still so many crazy things going out there. But again, if you shift your mind, your role is not to be the expert and give the answer. Your role is to create a learning environment. And the great part of what you should be communicating is that process and learning all the way. Like, I love when you just said, hey, we learned this about recognition. And because of this, we're communicating our intention, which I think people, you get a lot of compassion cards if they know the intention, and we're going to try this, and yeah, it might not work, but here's what we're intending to do. And I think that comes across in this environment really. What I think people appreciate that, because it's a transparency, right, in what we're trying to do. But you just took all the pressure off of me and my listener, Cliff. I can't thank you enough. If we wanted to, dive into a little bit more, I mean, this could be a 2-hour conversation, a whole day. We could probably sit and chit chat about all the things you're doing. But if somebody did want to connect and say, hey, did you try this, or whatever, or how can we connect with you? And is that okay if they contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. People can reach out. You bet. Email address is pretty simple. It's just clifton.johnson@teachforamerica.org. And you can also find me on LinkedIn.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and good luck with this next, leg in our journey. I'm sure I'll follow up with you, and please stay connected with us.
Thanks, Sarah. Plenty more learning to do. Appreciate you.
Clarity. Regardless if you're working in the office or at home or even hybrid, having clear communication is key to any successful change. This year, we're all learning together, so let's be open to each other's learnings and ideas. You never know what surprises you might find along the way. Now, don't go away just yet. We have a new segment featuring our good friends from Ragan's Communications Leadership Council on how you can use today's episode learnings right now. Let's tune in.
Thank you so much for having us today. I'm Mandy Zaransky-Hurst, Ragan's Chief Operating Officer and Head of Communications Councils. Today I'm here with Halley Knigge from REI. Halley is the Director of Co-op Communications, and she's also a member of Ragan's Communications Leadership Council. Halley, thanks so much for being here today.
Sure, happy to be here.
Halley, I'd love to start off by you telling us a little bit about your role as Director of Co-op Communications for REI.
My team is responsible for all enterprise communications for REI Co-op for internal and external audiences. So PR and media relations, brand reputation building and defense, and employee communications to all employee or large employee audiences.
Can you speak to the philosophy that REI has on remote work, and in particular, start off by telling us a little bit about the headquarters that is no more?
Absolutely. So prior to 2020, we were in the process of building a beautiful new corporate campus in Bellevue, Washington's Spring District. So we'd been headquartered in a variety of buildings around the Puget Sound for a number of years. Our primary headquarters was in Kent, Washington, which is a suburb outside of Seattle. And we'd outgrown those buildings. And so we're working on this big indoor-outdoor connected campus in Bellevue. Then, of course, we all know what happened in early 2020, and we all were confronted with a global pandemic and widespread full-time remote work for most of our headquarters employees. And one of the things that we really learned during those months was how well we could all continue to collaborate and connect, even not in person. I'm speaking to you today from my home office. We're all still majority working from home. And, when we learned that, we realized, hey, maybe we actually don't need a single campus anymore. And maybe if we actually lean into the learnings that we've had this year, we could actually unlock even greater potential going forward. So we put that campus up for sale. So REI of the future is not going to have a corporate campus. Instead, we're still headquartered in the Northwest, and so we're standing up a handful of satellite offices. We're calling them base camps because we're your favorite outdoor retailer. And they're essentially co-working spaces around the Puget Sound where, if I had to be in person for some reason, some kind of brainstorming, whiteboarding session that was very important to be face-to-face with colleagues, I can go reserve a desk or a conference room at one of those sites. But really, my job is now 5 days a week mobile. My primary office is going to be my home office. And it's been very, very cool just to see the possibilities that have been unlocked with hiring a potential full-time remote worker. And honestly, especially in the comms space and employee comms for a company that has employees, in like 39 states around the country, I actually think our work gets even better when we're not all headquartered in the same place.
Now, Halley, what about the fact that there are so many desk workers, but there are also an incredible number of retail store floor workers? Is there a rift at all between those two groups when now there's a work anywhere philosophy, more or less, for the desk workers?
So yeah, we're very sensitive to the fact that there are employees who have had to be working in person, serving our customers throughout the pandemic, and that there are those of us who are able to work from home. But I think that's been, the remote work and the ability to work from anywhere has really been, seems like it's been a benefit to our employee base.
Is there a fear of culture erosion, or do you anticipate doing particular in-person events or other tactics to try and, make sure that culture is as strong as ever?
Sure. I'd say culture and connection are absolutely top of mind, especially for a company like REI that I think we're really known for being a great place to work and for having a really strong employee culture. One of the things that, we were delighted to find over the past year and a half is that there are a lot of ways to really engender culture and connection, even when we're not face to face. And we're really excited to explore the possibilities that come along with that. We're also doing a couple things that I just personally think are really cool, that are really going to help us in this sense. And one of them is the fact that, we didn't just expand our remote work policy, we totally sold our corporate headquarters. And so you're not going to have this headquarters or not kind of divide between employees. We're all mobile first going forward. So I think that's really cool. We're also coming into this really thoughtfully, and we've crafted a set of leadership norms or behaviors that we're asking all company directors and up to align to.
It's wonderful that you've created such a mindful culture, especially around manager communications and the way in which you care for your employees. What wisdom or comms tips would you like to share to others who might be listening today?
That's a great question. I think one thing that I'm just continually reminded of is that we all need to remind ourselves of every day, maybe write it on a Post-it note and put it on a wall, is just my experience is not everyone's experience. Some folks are really, really missing that in-person connection. And so just the empathy and reminding ourselves that our experiences are not everyone's experiences. I think also just one thing, especially in this remote setup, that we've found is so important is it's really easy to get into the day-to-day habit of, I see or chat with my team constantly throughout the day, every day. If I'm on a project with someone, I'm seeing them all the time. What I'm not doing is walking to the cafe to get a cup of coffee and seeing someone who I maybe work with from time to time, but haven't been on a project with recently. And so one thing that I realized after a few months into the pandemic was just there were people who I hadn't seen in months that normally I would see every day in the office. And so really finding ways to keep that, especially cross-divisional connection going so that you have those relationships still.
It's great. Really thoughtful, empathetic tips. But I think that in itself is part of what makes you a really excellent communicator, Halley. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing REI's thoughts and philosophy on remote work and some of your thoughts as the Director of Co-op Communications at REI. We really appreciate it.
A huge thank you to our sponsor, Ragan, Mandy Zorinsky-Hurst, and our featured guests for being a part of our new segment. If you're interested in more information about Ragan's Communications Leadership Council, an exclusive membership for senior-level communicators and their entire communications teams, please go to commscouncil@ragan.com. Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is also proudly supported by the Circle Broadcast Suite, an entire suite built for internal communicators. Learn more at circle.com. Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective. Don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.